Justice shapes human civilization more than almost any concept. Every legal system, every economic distribution, and every moral judgment relies on some notion of what people deserve. Yet, despite its centrality, justice remains one of philosophy's most contested ideas. The question cuts to our core. What makes actions, institutions, and distributions right or wrong? The stakes are not abstract. Justice determines who goes to prison and who goes free. It governs how wealth flows through societies and which inequalities we tolerate. It shapes the moral architecture of our minds from earliest childhood. When we feel wronged, our sense of justice triggers outrage that can topple governments. When we witness unfairness to others, it activates neural circuits that millions of years of evolution have refined. This exploration will dissect justice from every angle that reveals truth. We will trace its biological roots in primate behavior and infant psychology. We will examine the neural machinery that makes fairness intuitions fire before conscious thought. We will follow its intellectual evolution from ancient Athens to contemporary laboratories. We will probe the competing theories that philosophers have built, each claiming to capture justice's essence. And we will confront the hardest cases where our intuitions conflict and theories break down. The journey begins not with definitions, but with evidence. Justice is not merely an idea that philosophers invented. It is a feature of human psychology so deep that evolution wired it into neural tissue. Before we can understand what justice should be, we must grasp what it is. Part 1. The Biological Foundations. Justice did not spring fully formed from human reason. Long before Plato wrote the Republic, natural selection was sculpting fairness intuitions into primate brains. The human sense of justice has evolutionary origins that reach back millions of years. Understanding these biological roots reveals why justice feels visceral rather than merely logical. Researchers discovered something remarkable when they studied capuchin monkeys in controlled experiments. When one monkey received a cucumber slice for completing a task, she accepted it readily. But when her partner received a grape, a far more desirable reward for the same task, the first monkey often refused her cucumber. She would sometimes throw it back at the experimenter. This behavior is costly. The monkey sacrifices food to protest unequal treatment. This pattern, termed inequity aversion, appears across social primates. Chimpanzees, bonobos, dogs, and even ravens show similar responses to unequal reward distribution. The sensitivity becomes stronger when unequal pay lacks any connection to effort or merit. During cooperative tasks, primates refuse to work with partners who fail to contribute their share. Some will even punish free riders at cost to themselves. This is not uniquely human behavior. It represents an evolutionary strategy much older than our species. Why would evolution favor costly fairness preferences? The answer lies in the structure of cooperation. Large-scale cooperation between unrelated individuals is humanity's most distinctive trait. Unlike most species that cooperate only with close kin, humans cooperate with strangers across continents. This ultra-sociality required solving a fundamental problem. How do you prevent exploitation when cooperating with genetic strangers? Partner choice provided the evolutionary pressure. When individuals could choose their cooperative partners, those who offered fairer divisions attracted more collaborators. Selfish individuals found themselves isolated, excluded from beneficial exchanges. Mathematical models confirm that partner choice selects for equitable strategies. The bargaining occurred not at the conscious level, but through natural selection over thousands of generations. Those ancestors whose brains generated fairness preferences outcompeted those who lacked such intuitions. The result is a genuine sense of fairness that operates automatically, not rational calculation masquerading as emotion. Human infants demonstrate this innate moral machinery before cultural learning can shape their preferences. 6-month-old babies who cannot speak show surprise when puppets violate helping norms. By 8 months, infants prefer individuals who treat others fairly over those who act selfishly. 3-year-olds will equalize resource distributions even when inequality would benefit them. These preferences emerge too early to be products of socialization alone. Evolution built fairness detectors into developing brains. The neural architecture reveals itself through modern brain imaging. When adults experience unfair offers in economic games, the anterior insula activates intensely. This region processes disgust, including both physical revulsion and moral violations. Unfairness triggers the same visceral response as contaminated food. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which handles reasoning and self-control, must actively inhibit this response when people accept unfair but beneficial offers. Justice intuitions fire first, and rationality intervenes only with effort. More revealing still, people will pay personal costs to punish unfairness directed at others. In the ultimatum game, Player A proposes how to split money with Player B. Player B can accept or reject. If B rejects, both players get nothing. Standard economic theory predicts B should accept any positive offer since something exceeds nothing. Reality contradicts this prediction systematically. Offers below 30% of the total typically get rejected across cultures. People sacrifice real money to punish stingy proposers. Even more striking is third-party punishment. When observers watch one person treat another unfairly, they will spend their own resources to penalize the transgressor. This punishment provides no direct benefit to the punisher. Yet across 15 small-scale societies spanning 5 continents, researchers found universal willingness to impose costly punishment as inequality increases. The magnitude varies across populations, but the basic pattern holds everywhere. Humans are not merely self-interested calculators. Our brains contain machinery dedicated to enforcing fairness norms, even towards strangers, even at personal cost. This machinery served crucial functions in ancestral environments. Anthropological evidence from contemporary hunter-gatherer societies reveals pervasive egalitarianism. These groups practice extensive food sharing, actively resist dominance hierarchies, and sanction hoarding behavior. In small bands, where everyone knows everyone, reputation determines survival and reproduction. Violating fairness norms damage biological fitness directly. Natural selection calibrated minds to be acutely sensitive to justice violations. Yet this biological foundation creates complications for modern justice. Evolution shaped fairness intuitions for small-scale societies of between 50 and 150 individuals. Our instincts did not evolve for anonymous markets, bureaucratic institutions, or global resource distribution. When group size exceeds 150, the psychological mechanisms that sustain cooperation in face-to-face groups begin breaking down. Survival instincts and competition may override fairness preferences when different groups compete for scarce resources. The scalability of prosocial behavior remains an open question. The human sense of fairness splits into distinct neural and psychological systems. Unfairness to self produces reactive, automatic, emotionally driven responses. The insula fires immediately, generating visceral aversion. Unfairness to others engages different circuits, recruiting more deliberate and rational processing. Brain regions associated with perspective-taking and theory of mind activate when evaluating third-party violations. We care about both types of unfairness, but through different mechanisms. This biological story establishes a foundation. Justice is not purely cultural construction, though culture shapes its expression. Justice is not merely rational principle, though reason can examine and refine it. Justice reflects deep features of human psychology that evolution engineered over millions of years. Understanding this biological bedrock explains why justice feels urgent rather than optional. It clarifies why fairness violations trigger emotions that rational argument cannot easily override. And it warns us that our justice intuitions, however strong, may not scale straightforwardly from hunter-gatherer bands to contemporary mass societies. The evolutionary analysis reveals both the power and limits of innate fairness. Evolution gave us moral machinery capable of sustaining cooperation among strangers. But that same machinery can malfunction when applied to contexts vastly different from ancestral environments. Modern justice requires supplementing biological instincts with carefully constructed institutions and reasoned principles. The task becomes: how can we build systems that honor our evolved moral psychology while transcending its limitations? Part 2. Ancient Foundations. The systematic study of justice begins in ancient Athens during the 5th century BCE. Plato's Republic, written around 375 BCE, transformed justice from customary practice into philosophical problem. The dialogue opens with a deceptively simple question: is it always better to be just than unjust? This question drives 10 books of argument that shaped Western thought for millennia. Plato confronts 3 rival views before building his own theory. Cephalus represents the conventional perspective that justice means telling truth and paying debts. This definition collapses quickly. Returning a weapon to its owner seems just until you realize the owner has gone mad. Simple rules fail when contexts shift. Polemarchus refines this to helping friends and harming enemies, but Socrates demonstrates this makes justice situation dependent. If your friend is actually wicked, helping him increases injustice in the world. Thrasymachus offers a darker challenge that still resonates today. Justice is nothing but the advantage of the stronger, he argues. Those with power create laws that serve their interests and call this justice. Morality is a convenient fiction that the powerful use to control the weak. The unjust person who can avoid punishment lives better than the just fool who follows rules. Thrasymachus articulates what later thinkers call moral skepticism. No objective moral qualities exist in reality. Only power and expedience matter. Plato recognizes that refuting Thrasymachus requires more than logical argument. The question is too complex, and the temptation toward expedience too strong. He shifts strategy from Socratic dialogue to constructive theory building. If we cannot observe justice clearly in individual souls, perhaps we can see it writ large in cities. By examining the just city, we might understand the just person. Plato's ideal city contains three classes that mirror the human soul's three parts. Rulers pursue wisdom and govern based on knowledge of eternal forms. Guardians provide defense and embody courage tempered by discipline. Producers, including farmers and craftsmen, supply material needs and practice moderation. Political justice exists when each class performs its proper function without interfering with others. The carpenter should not attempt to rule, and the philosopher should not abandon thought for commerce. This maps directly onto individual psychology. Reason desires truth and the good of the whole person. Spirit concerns itself with honor and competitive achievement. Appetite seeks immediate pleasures, including food, drink, and sex. Individual justice is psychic harmony, where each part performs its proper role. Reason understands the genuine good and directs the personality. Spirit allies with reason to control appetite's destructive impulses. The just soul is an ordered soul, not a battlefield of warring desires. The parallel reveals Plato's core insight. Justice is not merely external behavior, but internal condition. You cannot be truly just by simply following rules while your soul churns with destructive passions. Justice requires harmony between reason, spirit, and appetite, such that each part wants what is genuinely good. The just person acts justly naturally, not through gritted teeth, suppressing contrary urges. This makes justice constitutive of happiness, rather than instrumental to it. Plato grounds this in his theory of forms. Justice, goodness, and beauty exist as eternal, unchanging realities beyond physical world. We encounter only imperfect copies and approximations in daily life. True knowledge requires grasping these forms through pure reason. Only philosopher rulers who have contemplated the form of justice can govern justly. Their knowledge is not opinion or convention, but genuine understanding of objective moral truth. Critics have challenged every element of this theory. The rigid class system seems to deny individual freedom and social mobility. Karl Popper argued the Republic describes totalitarian state where individuals exist merely to serve collective harmony. The working class becomes human cattle with no voice in governance. Plato has redefined justice from resolving disputes between individuals to keeping everyone in their assigned place. This inverts what most people mean by justice. Other interpreters read the Republic as sophisticated irony. Leo Strauss suggested Plato meant to expose the impossibility of the ideal city, not advocate for it. The city requires abolishing family, common ownership of property, and philosopher kings with perfect knowledge. These conditions could never obtain in reality. Perhaps Plato constructed an impossible ideal to show justice in practice requires accepting imperfection. The dialogue may be thought experiment rather than political blueprint. Yet Plato's academy produced actual tyrants who ruled real cities. Students, including Clearchus of Heraclea and Hermias of Atarneus, seized power and governed autocratically. They had direct contact with Plato and intimate knowledge of his philosophy. If the Republic contained merely ironic thought experiment, these educated men missed the irony completely. The practical influence suggests Plato intended his ideal seriously, however unrealizable it proved. Aristotle, Plato's student, builds a different theory in Nicomachean Ethics Book 5. He begins by distinguishing general justice from particular justice. General justice means complete virtue in relation to others, essentially lawfulness and moral excellence overall. Particular justice concerns specific domains of fair dealing. Aristotle focuses on three types of particular justice that structure legal and economic life. Distributive justice governs allocation of honor, wealth and benefits among community members. The key principle is proportionality according to merit. Those who contribute more to the community deserve greater shares of its resources. This is geometric proportion, not arithmetic equality. If person A contributes twice what person B contributes, A should receive twice the benefits. The ratio between contributions and rewards must remain constant. But what counts as contribution or merit? Aristotle acknowledges different societies use different criteria. Oligarchies distribute according to wealth, democracies according to freedom, aristocracies according to virtue. Each system claims its standard captures true merit. Aristotle favours virtue as the appropriate measure, since the virtuous make the greatest contributions to communal flourishing. This embeds aristocratic bias directly into his justice theory. Women, labourers and slaves cannot fully exercise virtue given their limited freedom and leisure. Therefore, they rightly receive smaller shares of social goods. Distributive justice reinforces existing hierarchies by treating unequal starting positions as natural differences in merit. Corrective justice addresses wrongs between individuals through litigation and punishment. When one person harms another, equality has been disrupted. The harm-doer gained advantage while the victim suffered loss. Corrective justice restores the prior equilibrium by imposing penalties that remove the wrongdoer's gain. This uses arithmetic equality, not geometric proportion. The judge calculates the difference between gain and loss, then transfers that amount back. Justice is the mathematical midpoint between excess and deficiency. Both voluntary transactions like contracts and involuntary harms like assault fall under corrective justice. Aristotle adds justice in exchange, also called reciprocal or commutative justice. Commercial transactions must preserve proportional equality between goods exchanged. A shoemaker cannot trade one shoe for a farmer's entire harvest. Instead, the shoemaker must provide shoes whose total value equals the crops received. Money solves this problem by creating common measure based on need. Markets work when exchanges reflect genuine proportional value rather than exploitative ratios. The crucial insight connecting all three types is proportion. Justice maintains appropriate ratios between contributions and rewards, harms and punishments, goods and prices. Injustice occurs when these proportions get distorted. The thief takes more than his due, the victim receives less. The lazy worker demands equal pay with the diligent worker, violating merit proportions. Justice restores proper mathematical relationships between people and things. Aristotle diverges from Plato on justice's relationship to other virtues. For Plato, justice is the master virtue that harmonizes all other excellences. For Aristotle, justice is unique because it exists only in relation to others. Courage, temperance, and wisdom can be practiced alone. Justice requires community and only emerges in social interaction. You cannot be just in isolation. This makes justice simultaneously the most complete virtue and the most limited. It encompasses all other virtues when directed toward others' good, yet has no content apart from social relations. Both theories share fundamental assumptions that shaped Western thought. First, justice is objective reality discoverable through reason, not subjective preference or cultural construction. Second, justice connects necessarily to human flourishing and happiness. The just life is better for the person living it, not merely better for society. Third, justice requires proper ordering of parts within wholes. Whether parts of the soul or classes in the city, justice means each element functioning appropriately. Fourth, knowledge matters crucially for justice. You cannot be fully just through habit alone. You need understanding of what justice is. Yet the theories differ profoundly on where to locate justice. Plato makes it internal harmony, a psychic state independent of external actions in crucial respects. Aristotle makes it primarily behavioral, though acknowledging character matters for fully virtuous action. Plato emphasizes the soul's structure and the forms underlying reality. Aristotle emphasizes practical wisdom and the actual distribution of goods among real people. Plato builds from metaphysics downward. Aristotle builds from political observation upward. These ancient theories establish problems that still dominate justice discourse. Should justice focus on outcomes or character? Is equality or proportional desert the proper standard? How do we balance individual good against collective welfare? Can reason alone determine what justice requires, or do emotions and intuitions play legitimate roles? What is the relationship between justice and other values like freedom, efficiency, or happiness? Every contemporary theory takes positions on questions the Greeks first articulated. The Greek frameworks also embedded limitations that later thinkers struggled to overcome. Both Plato and Aristotle accepted slavery as natural. Both excluded women from full political participation. Both assumed small city-states as the natural political unit, not global community. Both tied justice tightly to desert and merit without considering whether initial inequalities might be unjust. And both focused on free male citizens, leaving vast populations outside justice's scope entirely. Modern philosophy inherited these problems along with the insights. The task became preserving what the Greeks discovered about justice while abandoning their parochialism. Could justice extend beyond the polis to all humanity? Could it include those who cannot participate in rational deliberation? Could it challenge rather than reinforce existing social hierarchies? These questions required new theoretical frameworks. Part 3. The three modern frameworks. Modern philosophy reconceived justice through three grand frameworks that dominate contemporary debate: utilitarianism, contractarianism, and egalitarianism each offer comprehensive visions of what justice demands. Understanding their core logic, their evolution, and their tensions illuminates current arguments about rights, welfare, and distribution. Each framework captures genuine moral insights while creating serious problems. Utilitarianism emerged in the late 18th century with Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Its fundamental principle is deceptively simple. Actions and policies are just when they maximize overall utility. Utility originally meant pleasure, the only thing with intrinsic value, according to Bentham. Everything else has merely instrumental worth insofar as it produces pleasure or prevents pain. Mill broadened this to happiness or fulfillment rather than crude pleasure. Modern utilitarians typically define utility as preference satisfaction, giving people what they actually want. The utilitarian calculus proceeds straightforwardly in principle. Calculate the total utility produced by each available action or policy. Choose the option generating the greatest sum. Each person counts equally in the calculation. No one's welfare gets special weight. This creates powerful egalitarian foundation. The prince's pleasure counts no more than the pauper's when computing total utility. Justice becomes impartial concern for everyone's welfare equally. This framework promises to resolve distributional conflicts through calculation rather than intuition. How much should society spend on healthcare versus education? Measure how much utility each spending option produces, then allocate resources accordingly. Should we allow free speech even when it causes offence? Calculate whether permitting controversial speech maximizes overall utility compared to censorship's effects. Every question of justice becomes an empirical matter of measuring consequences. Yet utilitarianism faces devastating objections that philosophers have refined over 2 centuries. First, it ignores the distribution of utility across individuals. Suppose we can give one person intense pleasure by causing 99 people mild discomfort. If the pleasure outweighs the summed discomfort, utilitarianism endorses this distribution. But this seems wrong. Justice cares about how benefits and burdens distribute, not merely their total. A society where most people live miserably while a few experience ecstasy could maximize utility, yet strike us as profoundly unjust. Second, utilitarianism appears to permit horrific injustices if they maximize utility. Could we torture one innocent person to prevent greater suffering elsewhere? The logic of maximization says yes when the numbers favor it. Could we enslave a minority if doing so produces greater happiness for the majority? Again, utility calculation might endorse this outcome. Most people have strong intuitions that certain actions are wrong, regardless of consequences. Utilitarianism treats these intuitions as mere squeamishness to be overcome through clear thinking. Third, the theory faces practical impossibility. We cannot actually measure and compare utility across millions of people for every policy decision. How many units of utility does this person get from eating ice cream compared to another person reading poetry? Interpersonal utility comparisons require accessing subjective mental states that remain fundamentally private. Even if we could measure individual utilities precisely, we lack methods to aggregate them meaningfully. Different aggregation functions produce different policy recommendations with no principled way to choose between them. Fourth, utilitarianism makes justice hostage to contingent facts about human psychology. If people happen to derive great pleasure from cruelty, maximizing utility would require permitting cruel practices. But most people believe justice is objective, not dependent on what happens to make humans happy. If our preferences were different, utilitarians must say justice itself would be different. This makes morality disturbingly arbitrary. Defenders have refined utilitarianism extensively to handle these objections. Rule utilitarianism judges rules rather than individual acts by their tendency to maximize utility. Perhaps no single act of promise-breaking reduces overall welfare, but a society where promise-breaking is permitted suffers greatly. We should adopt and follow rules that maximize utility when generally practiced, even when breaking them occasionally would produce better outcomes. This protects important values like promise-keeping and individual rights while maintaining utilitarian foundations. Critics respond that rule utilitarianism collapses into act utilitarianism under pressure. Why follow a utility-maximizing rule when breaking it? This once would produce even better consequences. If maximizing utility is really the goal, following rules becomes irrational when deviation would serve that goal. Rule utilitarianism tries to have things both ways, honoring conventional morality through rules while claiming consequentialist foundations. The tension may be irresolvable. Contractarianism offers radically different foundations for justice. Rather than maximizing utility, justice consists in principles that rational people would agree to under fair conditions. The thought experiment imagines people choosing rules for social cooperation before knowing their own positions in society. What principles would everyone accept as fair from behind this veil of ignorance? Thomas Hobbes pioneered this approach in Leviathan during the 17th century. In the state of nature without government, life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Everyone has unlimited freedom, but constant insecurity. Rational individuals would agree to create sovereign authority with power to enforce peace. Justice consists in obeying the sovereign's laws because this social contract serves everyone's interests. The contract is hypothetical, not historical. It justifies political authority by showing rational people would consent to it. John Rawls transformed contractarianism in his 1971 book A Theory of Justice. He places individuals behind a veil of ignorance that hides their talents, social position, and even their conception of good life. You know general facts about human psychology and society. You know you will have personal goals and attachments. But you do not know whether you will be rich or poor, talented or disabled, member of majority or minority. From this original position, what principles of justice would you choose? Rawls argues rational people would select two principles. First, each person has equal right to the most extensive basic liberties compatible with similar liberties for all. This protects fundamental freedoms, including speech, assembly, conscience, and political participation. These liberties can only be restricted to protect other equal liberties, never sacrificed for greater utility. Second, social and economic inequalities must satisfy two conditions. They must attach to positions open to all under fair equality of opportunity. And they must benefit the least advantaged members of society, a principle Rawls calls the difference principle. Inequality is just only when it makes the worst off better off than they would be under equality. If paying doctors more improves healthcare so much that even the poorest receive better medical treatment, the inequality is justified. But inequality that merely concentrates wealth without trickling down violates justice. The brilliance of Rawls's construction is how it combines intuitions from competing traditions. The equal liberty principle captures liberal commitment to individual rights. The difference principle incorporates egalitarian concern for the disadvantaged without mandating strict equality. The opportunity principle honors meritocratic intuitions while insisting background conditions must be fair. Rawls synthesizes liberty, equality, and efficiency through principles rational people would accept from impartial standpoint. Yet contractarianism faces its own difficulties. Why should actual justice depend on hypothetical agreement? Real people never stood behind any veil of ignorance or consented to social contract. The thought experiment reveals what would be rational to choose under certain conditions, not what actual people owe each other. Critics argue this makes justice dependent on counterfactual agreement rather than on objective moral facts. The veil of ignorance itself embeds controversial assumptions. Rawls assumes people behind the veil are risk-averse, preferring to protect the worst-case outcome. This generates the difference principle's focus on the least advantaged. But rational people might be risk-neutral or even risk-acceptant, willing to gamble on landing in favorable positions. Different risk attitudes generate different principles of justice from identical original position. The thought experiment does not uniquely determine justice's content. More fundamentally, contractarianism excludes beings who cannot participate in rational agreement. Animals, future generations, and severely cognitively disabled humans lack capacity to choose principles from original position. Does this mean we have no duties of justice toward them? Rawls explicitly excludes animals from justice's scope, allowing only duties of compassion. This seems arbitrary. If justice protects important interests, why should capacity for rational choice determine whose interests count? Egalitarianism provides the third major framework by making equality itself foundational. Strict egalitarianism holds that justice requires distributing all goods equally unless inequality benefits everyone. More sophisticated versions ask what should be equalized: welfare, resources, capabilities, or opportunities. Each answer generates distinct theory with different practical implications. Welfare egalitarianism says justice requires equalizing well-being across individuals. If one person suffers while another thrives, justice demands transfers that level their welfare. This captures intuition that what ultimately matters is how well people's lives go, not abstract distributions of resources. But measuring welfare remains problematic, and equalizing it may require massive invasions of liberty. If expensive tastes make you miserable, must society fund your champagne until your welfare matches others' beer-drinking happiness? Resource egalitarianism says justice requires equal shares of resources like wealth, rights, and opportunities. Ronald Dworkin argues for equality of resources rather than welfare to preserve responsibility for choices. If you voluntarily choose expensive lifestyle, you cannot claim injustice when this leaves you resource poor. Justice provides equal starting points. Individuals bear responsibility for how they use those resources. This seems to avoid expensive taste problems while maintaining egalitarian commitment. But which resources should be equalized? Amartya Sen argues resources matter only as means to valuable capabilities. A wheelchair provides mobility capability to disabled person, but provides nothing to able-bodied person. Equalizing resources like wheelchairs makes no sense. We should equalize capabilities like being able to move freely. Justice requires ensuring everyone can achieve valuable functionings like health, knowledge, and political participation. This shifts focus from means to ends, from what people have to what they can do and be. All three frameworks generate ongoing debates about scope and priority. Utilitarians must specify which utility matters: pleasure, happiness, preference satisfaction, or something else. Contractarians must specify the choice situation. How much information do people have? What motivates them? What risks do they face? Egalitarians must specify what to equalize: welfare, resources, capabilities, or opportunities. Each specification leads to different theory with different policy implications. The frameworks also conflict systematically on practical questions. Utilitarianism might endorse inequality that increases total welfare even if it harms the worst off. Egalitarianism might require reducing inequality even when this makes everyone, including the poor, worse off absolutely. Contractarianism protects basic liberties even when restricting them would maximize utility or reduce inequality. There is no meta-theory that resolves these conflicts without privileging one framework's fundamental commitments over others. Recent work attempts synthesis or transcendence of this trilemma. Capability approaches combine egalitarian concern for distribution with perfectionist claims about valuable functionings. Luck egalitarianism tries to separate unjust inequalities from personal responsibility. Relational egalitarianism focuses on social equality and equal standing rather than distributional patterns. Each synthesis captures something important while inheriting unresolved tensions from its parent theories. The three frameworks remain indispensable despite their problems. They crystallize fundamental moral ideas that any adequate justice theory must address. Utilitarianism insists consequences matter. We cannot ignore how policies affect human welfare. Contractarianism insists on justifiability to those affected. Legitimate principles must be ones people could rationally accept. Egalitarianism insists on equal moral worth. One person's interests do not count for less simply because they are less powerful. Complete theory would honor all three insights while resolving their tensions. Whether such theory is possible remains philosophy's central challenge in justice. Part 4. Distributive Justice. How should society allocate resources, opportunities and burdens among its members? This question of distributive justice generates more political conflict than any other. Every tax policy, welfare program and economic regulation embodies some vision of fair distribution. Yet competing principles yield radically different distributions that cannot be simultaneously satisfied. The fundamental tension lies between three incompatible criteria. Should we distribute according to equality, giving everyone the same? Should we distribute according to need, giving more to those who lack? Should we distribute according to desert, giving more to those who merit it through effort or contribution? Each criterion captures something morally important. Each generates conclusions the others reject as unjust. Strict equality holds that justice requires giving everyone identical shares. If we have 100 units of wealth and 10 people, each receives 10 units. This respects equal moral worth most directly. No one counts more than anyone else, so everyone gets the same. Deviations from equality require justification. Equality serves as the default distribution that presumptively satisfies justice. Yet strict equality faces immediate objections. People have different needs that require different resources to satisfy. The disabled person requires expensive medical equipment to achieve functioning the able-bodied person achieves without cost. Giving them equal money leaves the disabled person worse off in capability terms. Equal treatment of unequals perpetuates disadvantage rather than correcting it. Furthermore, strict equality eliminates incentives for productive effort. If everyone receives identical shares regardless of contribution, why would anyone work hard? The rational strategy is free riding on others' labour. But if everyone reasons this way, total production collapses and everyone ends up worse off absolutely. Equality of outcome may undermine the productivity that makes any reasonable distribution possible. Need-based distribution allocates resources to satisfy everyone's requirements for decent life. Those with greater needs receive more. Those with lesser needs receive less. From each according to ability, to each according to need, as Marx formulated it. This ensures no one falls below minimum threshold of well-being regardless of productivity or social contribution. But identifying genuine needs proves extraordinarily difficult. Are needs objective facts about human biology or subjective judgments about acceptable living standards? Do needs include only food and shelter, or also education, healthcare, and cultural participation? Societies disagree dramatically about what counts as genuine need versus luxury preference. Moreover, need-based distribution faces the same incentive problems as strict equality. If greater need generates greater resources, people have incentives to become or appear needy. The system may reward helplessness and punish self-sufficiency perversely. Desert-based distribution allocates according to what people merit through their efforts and contributions. Those who work harder, develop valuable skills, or produce more social value deserve proportionally greater rewards. This preserves incentives for productivity while honoring intuition that rewards should track contribution. The surgeon who saves lives deserves more than the person who produces nothing. Yet desert collapses under philosophical scrutiny. What we produce depends overwhelmingly on factors beyond our control. Natural talents, family background, educational opportunities, and social connections determine life outcomes far more than individual effort. The talented person born to wealth who becomes successful had life advantages the poor, untalented person never enjoyed. If we do not deserve our talents or circumstances, can we really deserve what those talents and circumstances enable us to achieve? Desert seems to require impossible metaphysical foundations in free will and self-creation. Moreover, markets reward scarcity rather than desert. The mediocre athlete, born when his sport suddenly becomes popular, may earn millions. The equally talented athlete, born a generation earlier when no one cared about that sport, earns nothing. Market value reflects supply, demand, and social preferences, not intrinsic merit or effort. Using market outcomes as measures of desert confuses contingent social facts with moral claims. Rawls attempts to transcend this debate through his difference principle. Start from equality as baseline, then permit only inequalities that benefit the least advantaged. This combines egalitarian presumption with recognition that some inequality may improve everyone's absolute position. Paying doctors more attracts talented people to medicine, improving healthcare for all, including the poor. But inequality that merely enriches the wealthy without trickling down remains unjust. Critics argue the difference principle is too demanding. It requires maximizing the position of the worst off, not merely ensuring decent minimum. If small reduction to the very wealthy would produce tiny improvement for the poor, justice demands it. This seems to make the rich mere instruments for benefiting the poor rather than respecting their claims. Alternatively, critics argue the principle is insufficiently demanding. It permits massive inequality provided the worst off are slightly better than they would be under equality. Billionaires and homeless people can coexist justly if eliminating billionaires would somehow marginally harm the homeless. Economic science complicates distributive justice enormously. The relationship between equality and growth remains empirically contested. Some research suggests more equal societies have higher growth because they invest more in human capital and maintain social stability. Other research suggests inequality drives growth by rewarding innovation and investment. If forced to choose between greater equality with less total wealth or less equality with more total wealth, which serves justice? The answer depends on whether we prioritize relative position or absolute well-being. Taxation exemplifies these conflicts in practice. Progressive taxation takes higher percentage from the wealthy to fund programs benefiting the poor. This reduces inequality and satisfies need-based principles. But it also reduces incentives for high earners and arguably violates desert by taking what people earned. Libertarians argue taxation is forced labor, compelling people to work for others' benefit. Egalitarians argue the wealthy owe their success to social cooperation and infrastructure that society provided. No empirical facts resolve this normative disagreement about what people deserve versus what they owe. Inheritance poses particularly acute problems. Parents naturally want to benefit their children by transferring wealth between generations. But inheritance perpetuates inequality unrelated to the heir's own efforts or desert. Children of wealthy parents start life with vast advantages purely through birth lottery. This violates equality of opportunity principles that even many inequality defenders endorse. Yet restricting inheritance interferes with family autonomy and parental authority that many consider fundamental rights. Justice pulls in opposite directions simultaneously. Global distribution raises the stakes infinitely higher. Average income in wealthy countries exceeds average income in poor countries by factors exceeding 100 to 1. Billions of people lack access to clean water, adequate nutrition, and basic health care. If justice requires equalizing life prospects, the implications are revolutionary. Citizens of wealthy countries would need to transfer vast portions of their wealth to the global poor. But does justice extend across borders, or do special obligations obtain only among fellow citizens? Cosmopolitans argue justice has no boundaries. Equal moral worth does not depend on shared citizenship or national identity. If affluent people can save lives by donating to effective charities at minimal cost to themselves, justice requires these transfers. The fact that the desperate live far away rather than nearby makes no moral difference. National boundaries are morally arbitrary, like race or gender. Nationalists argue justice operates only within political communities bound by reciprocal institutions. You owe fellow citizens more than foreigners because you participate in shared coercive system of law. The legitimacy of forcing people to pay taxes depends on reciprocal benefits of social cooperation. These institutions do not extend globally, so neither do the most demanding principles of distributive justice. You have humanitarian duties to prevent extreme suffering, but not duties of distributive justice to equalize with distant strangers. Recent research on fairness psychology reveals complicating factors. Economic experiments using ultimatum and dictator games show that fairness preferences vary systematically across societies. Market integration positively correlates with fairness in offers. People in societies with extensive market exchange make more equal offers than those in relatively isolated communities. Community size positively correlates with costly punishment of unfair behavior. Larger-scale cooperation requires and perhaps produces stronger fairness enforcement mechanisms. This suggests distributive preferences are partially culturally constructed rather than purely innate or rationally derived. Different economic systems cultivate different intuitions about fair distribution. Capitalism may promote certain fairness norms, while communalism promotes others. This does not prove all systems equally just, but it warns against assuming our own fairness intuitions are universal. Principles that seem self-evidently just may reflect enculturation rather than objective moral truth. Behavioral economics also reveals systematic deviations from theoretical rationality in distributive judgments. People care about relative position, not merely absolute well-being. Earning $50,000 feels satisfying when neighbours earn $40,000, but unsatisfying when neighbours earn $70,000. This relative deprivation drives much sense of injustice. But should justice accommodate these preferences for relative standing, or should it focus exclusively on absolute capabilities? Theories disagree fundamentally on whether positional concerns deserve moral weight. Loss aversion creates asymmetry between gaining and losing. Taking away resources that people already have feels far more unjust than failing to provide additional resources they never possessed. This gives conservative bias to distributive justice. Current distributions feel natural and just even when they resulted from historical injustices. Correcting past wrongs requires imposing losses on current holders that feel deeply unfair to them. Psychology makes justice backward-looking in ways that entrench existing inequality. The practical challenge for distributive justice is designing institutions that balance competing principles reasonably. Most societies combine elements of equality, need, and desert through mixed systems. Basic rights and services distribute equally to all citizens. Safety nets provide greater support to those with greater needs. Market economies reward productivity and talent, at least roughly. The question becomes finding the right mixture rather than implementing any pure principle. Yet political reality imposes severe constraints. Policies that voters perceive as unjust will not survive democratic politics regardless of philosophical argument. People have strong intuitions that welfare should be conditional on work, that effort should be rewarded, and that their own property rights should be secure. Theories that violate these intuitions too severely lack political viability, even if philosophically superior. Real distributive justice must be not only philosophically defensible, but also psychologically acceptable to populations who must live under it. Part 5. Procedural versus substantive justice. Justice divides into two fundamentally different concerns that pull against each other. Substantive justice asks whether outcomes are fair in themselves. Procedural justice asks whether the processes producing outcomes are fair. These can conflict radically. Fair procedures sometimes generate unfair results, while fair results sometimes require unfair procedures. Understanding this tension is critical for legal systems, political institutions, and everyday moral judgment. Pure procedural justice exists when no independent criterion of just outcome obtains. Instead, whatever results from fair procedure automatically counts as just. Gambling exemplifies this structure. If players enter a game voluntarily under fair rules with equal chances, whoever wins deserves their winnings. There is no right answer about who should win determined in advance of playing. The fair procedure itself creates justice. Robert Nozick builds an entire theory of justice on this foundation. Holdings are just if acquired through legitimate means from someone who legitimately held them, tracing back to just initial acquisition. How resources are distributed at any moment is irrelevant to justice. What matters entirely is the historical sequence of transfers that produced current holdings. If every step was voluntary and legitimate, the final distribution is just regardless of how unequal it appears. Justice is in the process, not the pattern. This entitlement theory protects liberty by prohibiting redistribution. If I justly acquired my wealth through legitimate labour and voluntary exchange, the government has no right to take it. Taxation for redistribution is forced labour, compelling me to work for others' benefit against my will. Even if redistribution would produce better outcomes by some measure, it violates the rights of property holders. Process, constraints, override, outcome considerations. Critics argue Nozick's theory ignores how initial acquisitions occurred. Property rights trace back to historical injustices, including slavery, genocide, and theft. Current holders cannot show unbroken chain of just transfers back to legitimate first ownership. If original acquisitions were unjust, the entire chain is tainted regardless of how legitimate subsequent transfers appeared. Historical injustice undermines any purely procedural theory that relies on just initial conditions. Moreover, pure procedural justice assumes equal bargaining power and full information. But real-world exchanges occur under conditions of vast inequality that coerce consent. The desperately poor person who accepts exploitative wages because the alternative is starvation has not truly consented freely. Formal freedom means nothing when material circumstances eliminate real options. Procedures that appear fair in abstract become unjust when embedded in unjust background conditions. Perfect procedural justice exists when we have independent standard of just outcome and a procedure guaranteed to produce it. Dividing a cake fairly illustrates this. The just outcome is equal portions for each person. The fair procedure is letting one person cut and letting others choose first. Self-interest guarantees the cutter divides equally, since any inequality will disadvantage them. The procedure reliably generates the substantively just outcome. But perfect procedural justice rarely obtains in complex social situations. We face imperfect procedural justice where we know what just outcome would be, but lack procedures that reliably produce it. Criminal trials aim at convicting the guilty and acquitting the innocent. Yet any feasible trial procedure will sometimes convict innocent people and acquit guilty people. We cannot design process that perfectly achieves substantive justice in every case. This creates agonizing trade-offs in legal system design. Should we require higher burden of proof to minimize false convictions, accepting more false acquittals? Should we permit aggressive interrogation that might extract true confessions but also coerce false ones? Should we allow all relevant evidence even when obtaining it violated privacy rights? Each choice trades one aspect of justice against another with no perfect solution available. Common law tradition emphasizes procedural fairness through adversarial system. Each side presents its strongest case before neutral judge or jury. The truth emerges through competition between opposing advocates. Strict evidentiary rules protect against unreliable evidence even when this excludes relevant information. Right to counsel ensures neither poverty nor legal ignorance disadvantages parties systematically. These procedures aim at just outcomes but value fair process even when it permits substantive errors. Critics argue adversarial process favors wealthy parties who can afford better lawyers. Justice should not depend on who hires the most skilled advocate. Inquisitorial systems, where judges actively investigate, may reach truth more reliably than adversarial combat. But inquisitorial systems risk judge bias and reduce protections against government overreach. No system avoids the trade-off between procedural protection and substantive accuracy. Due process doctrine embeds procedural justice in constitutional law. Government cannot deprive people of life, liberty, or property without fair procedures. What procedures are due depends on the interests at stake and the risk of error. Capital punishment requires more rigorous procedures than parking fines because the stakes are incomparably higher. But even when outcomes would be substantively identical, denial of process itself violates justice. People have right to be heard regardless of whether hearing would change the result. This reveals deep moral intuition that procedures express respect for persons. Fair process treats people as rational agents entitled to participate in decisions affecting them. Being judged without opportunity to present your case treats you as mere object rather than subject. Even when authorities are certain of correct outcome, imposing it without fair process degrades human dignity. Process has intrinsic value beyond its instrumental role in reaching correct outcomes. Yet, taken to extremes, procedural requirements can obstruct substantive justice entirely. Endless appeals and procedural motions can delay justice for decades. Guilty parties escape punishment through technicalities unrelated to their actual culpability. Rigid adherence to process becomes form over substance, protecting the guilty while frustrating victims' legitimate claims. Some balance between procedure and substance is essential, though the right balance remains contested. Political legitimacy depends crucially on procedural justice in lawmaking itself. Democratic procedures give laws legitimacy even when policies are substantively wrong. If majority votes for bad policy through fair democratic process, the policy has legitimacy that justifies enforcement despite being mistaken. But democracy alone cannot legitimate all possible laws. Majority cannot legitimately vote to enslave minority no matter how proper the procedures. Substantive limits constrain even the fairest processes. Constitutional democracies embed this insight through limits on majority rule. Basic rights cannot be eliminated by simple majority vote. Supermajority requirements, judicial review, and separation of powers protect substantive values against procedural override. These constraints make democracy less procedurally pure, but more substantively just. The tension between democratic procedure and substantive rights generates perpetual constitutional controversy. Workplace justice illustrates these conflicts in daily life. Should employees have procedural rights to challenge firings, even in employment-at-will systems? Requiring cause and process protects against arbitrary treatment, but reduces employer flexibility to make business decisions. Pure procedural justice says voluntary employment contracts govern without external imposition. But unequal bargaining power and asymmetric information make employment relationships inherently coercive for workers. Procedural protections become necessary to achieve substantive fairness. Economic markets represent procedural justice in distributive sphere. If all exchanges are voluntary and rights are respected, resulting distribution is just regardless of inequality. Market outcomes reflect accumulated voluntary choices under conditions of freedom. Interfering with these outcomes violates the procedural justice that generated them. But this assumes equal starting positions and fair background conditions that never actually obtain. Markets can be procedurally fair only if initial endowments are substantively just. Rawls recognizes this through his emphasis on background justice. Markets generate just outcomes only when operating within framework of just basic institutions. Fair equality of opportunity must be genuinely available to all. Basic needs must be met so people do not face coercive choice situations. Property rights must be structured to prevent excessive concentration of wealth and power. Pure procedural market justice requires extensive substantive preconditions that go far beyond formal freedom of contract. Discrimination law demonstrates the impossibility of purely procedural approaches. Formal equality before law prohibits explicit discrimination, but permits practices with discriminatory effects. Facially neutral procedures that systematically disadvantage protected groups raise justice concerns even without intentional bias. Should justice require equal outcomes across groups, or merely equal procedures regardless of disparate impacts? Procedural fairness is insufficient when systemic inequality makes neutral rules systematically burden minorities. International justice raises these issues at larger scale. Should global institutions prioritize procedural fairness where all nations have equal voice or substantive outcomes that protect the vulnerable? Small, impoverished nations have equal vote with superpowers in some international bodies. But this procedural equality may permit substantive injustices when powerful nations can ignore or circumvent institutions. Conversely, powerful nations imposing substantively better policies without consent of affected nations violates procedural justice through imperialism. Environmental regulation exemplifies the tension starkly. Democratic procedures give current generations authority to make policy affecting future generations who cannot vote. procedurally legitimate majority might impose massive costs on future people who have no voice in decisions. But who can legitimately override democratic procedures to protect future generations? Substantive justice may require constraining current democracy to protect those temporally distant others. Yet any such constraints face legitimacy challenges since they override democratic will. The ultimate question is whether fair procedures suffice for justice or merely support it. Can we ever say outcomes are unjust even when produced through impeccably fair processes? If so, this suggests substantive justice is primary and procedures are instrumental. If not, this makes justice radically dependent on contingent features of how decisions happen to be made. Most contemporary theories hold that both procedure and substance matter irreducibly. Fair processes have value beyond reaching correct outcomes, and some outcomes are wrong, regardless of genesis. But specifying when each consideration should prevail requires case-by-case judgment rather than general theory. Part 6. Scope and boundaries. Justice extends to some beings, but not others, creating philosophical problems with no consensus solutions. The boundary question asks, who or what deserves justice, and what determines inclusion within its scope? Every answer excludes some entities whose moral claims seem legitimate, while including others whose claims seem doubtful. These boundary cases expose fundamental tensions in how we conceive justice itself. Traditional theories restricted justice to rational agents capable of reciprocal cooperation. Aristotle explicitly limited justice to free male citizens of the polis. Women, children, slaves and foreigners fell outside justice's domain entirely. They might deserve kindness or compassion, but these are different moral categories than justice properly understood. Justice requires participation in shared political life through rational deliberation. Those incapable of such participation cannot be subjects of justice. Modern liberal theories broadened the scope dramatically but retained rationality requirements. All humans possess equal rights regardless of race, gender or nationality. Yet even this expansion rests on capacities for rational agency and moral personality. Beings who lack these capacities raise profound difficulties for justice theories built on contractarian foundations. Non-human animals present the first boundary challenge. Billions of animals experience suffering and have interests in avoiding pain and death. If justice protects important interests from being sacrificed without sufficient justification, why exclude animals categorically? Their inability to participate in rational agreement seems morally arbitrary. We do not exclude severely cognitively disabled humans from justice based on inability to reason. Why should species membership matter more than capacity for suffering or flourishing? Utilitarian approaches naturally extend justice to animals. Animals experience pleasure and pain, so their welfare enters utility calculations alongside human welfare. Peter Singer argues that equal consideration of interest requires including animal suffering equally with human suffering of similar intensity. The fact that suffering occurs in non-human nervous system makes no moral difference. Speciesism, privileging humans simply because they are human, is analogous to racism or sexism. It arbitrarily discounts morally relevant interests based on morally irrelevant characteristics. Contractarian theories struggle with animal inclusion. Rawls explicitly states that animals fall outside the theory of justice's scope. We have duties of compassion toward them and should not treat them cruelly. But these are not duties of justice because animals cannot reciprocate or participate in social cooperation. Justice applies only among free and equal persons capable of honouring its terms. Animals are objects of our duties, not subjects who have rights of justice. Critics argue this confuses the question of who has duties with who is owed duties. That animals cannot reciprocate does not mean they cannot be wronged. Infants cannot reciprocate yet clearly fall within justice's scope. The severely cognitively disabled cannot participate in contracts yet deserve justice. If we include these vulnerable humans, excluding animals with similar or greater cognitive capacities appears inconsistent. Either we must extend justice to animals or find principled way to exclude them without excluding vulnerable humans. Species membership itself provides one possible boundary. All humans have special moral status grounded in membership in Homo sapiens, regardless of individual capacities. This avoids drawing lines based on intelligence, rationality, or other traits that vary continuously. But critics respond that species membership is biological fact, with no obvious moral significance. Why should having human DNA rather than chimpanzee DNA determine fundamental moral status? This seems to assume precisely what needs justification. Marginal cases create persistent problems for any capacity-based boundary. Some humans lack capacities that even simple animals possess. The severely cognitively disabled, the permanently comatose, and anencephalic infants cannot reason, form preferences, or participate in reciprocity. If we include them within justice based on potential or species membership, we abandon capacity-based criteria. If we exclude them based on current capacities, we reach deeply counterintuitive conclusions about human moral status. No principle cleanly separates all humans from all non-humans while tracking morally relevant features. Martha Nussbaum argues that capabilities approach extends naturally to animals. Justice requires ensuring that beings can achieve characteristic species flourishing. For humans, this includes capabilities for reason, affiliation, and political participation. For other species, flourishing involves different capabilities appropriate to their form of life. Tigers need space to hunt. Elephants need social groups. Birds need freedom to fly. Justice demands we protect the capabilities central to each species' characteristic functioning. This grounds animal justice without reducing animals to mere receptacles of pleasure and pain. Future generations present equally vexing boundary problems. Decisions today about resource depletion, climate change, and technological development profoundly affect people not yet born. Do we owe duties of justice to future persons, or merely duties of benevolence? Future people cannot participate in current agreements or reciprocate benefits we provide them. They have no current preferences to be satisfied or frustrated. Yet the effects of our choices on their lives will be real and irreversible. Non-identity problem complicates this further. Our choices determine which future people will exist, not merely how existing people will fare. If we choose fossil fuel-intensive development, different people will be born than if we choose sustainable development. We cannot harm future persons by choosing policies that cause their existence, even if those policies leave them worse off than alternative persons would have been. If future persons cannot be harmed, can justice apply to them at all? This conclusion seems absurd, given obvious wrongness of degrading environment for generations hence. Contractarian theories again struggle with temporal extension. Rawls suggests that parties in original position should choose principles that apply across generations. They do not know which generation they belong to, so rational self-interest motivates just savings principles. But this seems artificial. Actual people know they are current generation and have no uncertainty about temporal location. Hypothetical ignorance does not bind real people who know where they stand in time. Intergenerational justice requires solving the sustainability question. Each generation should leave the world at least as good as they found it for subsequent generations. But measuring as good across vast timescales proves impossibly difficult. Should we compare material wealth, environmental quality, technological capability, or overall welfare? Different metrics suggest contradictory policies with no neutral way to adjudicate between them. Moreover, if technology enables future generations to solve problems we create, have we wronged them by bequeathing those problems? Discount rates embed profound moral choices about relative importance of present and future. Standard economic analysis discounts future costs and benefits, making harm occurring later matter less than equivalent harm now. But this systematically devalues future persons relative to present persons. Why should future suffering count less morally simply because it occurs temporally later? Any positive discount rate allows catastrophic long-term harms if they produce small short-term benefits. Yet zero discount rate seems to demand implausible sacrifices from present for distant future. The scope question extends to human groups and relationships. Does justice govern all human interactions, or only those within special relationships of reciprocity? Rawls suggests justice applies only among those who cooperate in mutually beneficial scheme over complete life. This may restrict justice to fellow citizens rather than extending globally. But why should justice depend on accidents of where political boundaries happen to be drawn? Shared citizenship is morally arbitrary in same way as race or gender. Global justice debates turn on whether justice is relational or non-relational. Relational theories hold that justice arises from and applies within particular relationships like citizenship or reciprocal cooperation. Non-relational theories hold that justice applies universally to all persons regardless of relationship. If justice is relational, we may have special duties to compatriots while owing foreigners only humanitarian aid. If justice is non-relational, national boundaries cannot limit scope of distributive obligations. The world's poor have claims of justice against the wealthy regardless of political boundaries. Coercion provides one possible basis for relational justice. We owe justice to those whom our institutions coercively govern. Citizens participate in shared coercive system of law that restricts their liberty and extracts resources through taxation. This coercion requires special justification that non-coercive interactions do not require. Since global coercive authority does not exist, neither do global duties of distributive justice. This preserves special domestic obligations while acknowledging weaker humanitarian duties globally. Critics respond that wealthy countries coerce poor countries through international economic system. Trade rules, intellectual property regimes, and financial institutions impose massive costs on developing nations. These are not natural facts, but political choices that rich countries could alter. If we harm poor countries through policies we impose, we owe them justice regardless of formal citizenship. The global economic order is itself a scheme of cooperation that generates duties of justice to all participants. Enemies and criminals raise special boundary problems. People who violate justice's norms forfeit some claims to justice in return. But how much and for how long remain deeply contested. Does criminal conviction justify any punishment state chooses, or do even criminals retain fundamental rights? During war, do enemy combatants fall outside justice's protection? Or do laws of war establish limits even in armed conflict? Can terrorists be tortured if torture yields information preventing future attacks? Most modern theories hold that justice places absolute limits that cannot be overridden. Even criminals retain human dignity and rights against degrading treatment. Even enemies remain moral persons who cannot be treated merely as means to victory. But these limits grow controversial when protecting them imposes serious costs on innocent people. If respecting terrorist rights prevents stopping attack that will kill hundreds, does justice really demand respecting those rights? Deontological theories say yes. Consequentialist theories may say no. Most people feel deeply conflicted. Artificial intelligence and potential future minds create speculative but important boundary cases. If machines achieve consciousness and self-awareness, do they enter justice's scope? Would conscious AI systems have rights against being exploited, shut down, or deleted? What about uploaded human minds existing as software rather than biological organisms? Current theories lack resources to address these questions because they assume biological substrate. But substrate may be morally irrelevant. What matters could be consciousness, preferences, or functional organization. Ecosystems themselves might have claims of justice distinct from interests of individual organisms. Destroying entire ecosystems harms something valuable beyond the suffering of individual animals. But can ecosystems be subjects of justice, or only objects that we have duties to preserve? The conceptual apparatus of rights, interests and justice seems to require individual subjects who can be benefited or harmed. Extending these concepts to holistic systems strains them beyond recognition. Yet treating ecosystems as mere property for human use seems to miss something morally significant. All boundary questions share common structure. Justice theories must specify what features ground moral status and what type of status those features ground. Rationality, sentience, species membership, social cooperation, vulnerability and potentiality all serve as proposed criteria in various theories. Each criterion has some intuitive appeal and faces serious objections. Moreover, the criteria come apart in different cases, requiring us to rank them in order of importance. No principled ranking commands consensus because fundamental disagreements about moral status remain unresolved. The practical stakes are enormous. How we draw boundaries determines which beings we can exploit, which we must protect, and which we must include in social cooperation. It determines whether we owe aid to distant strangers or only fellow citizens. It shapes our duties to future generations and responsibilities for environmental protection. These are not merely abstract philosophical puzzles, but urgent questions with life and death implications for billions of beings. Part 7. Justice in Practice. Abstract theories confront messy reality when institutions attempt to implement them. Real-world justice requires designing systems that function despite human imperfection, limited information, and conflicting incentives. Examining how justice operates in practice reveals both the power and limitations of philosophical principles. Theory and practice stand in dialectical relationship. Each reveals inadequacies in the other. Legal systems represent society's most direct attempt to instantiate justice through institutions. Criminal law aims at punishing wrongdoing proportionally while protecting the innocent. Yet every element of this simple formula generates profound difficulties in implementation. How do we determine guilt reliably given imperfect evidence and fallible witnesses? How do we measure culpability when mental states remain hidden and responsibility is distributed across multiple actors? How do we calibrate punishment to crime when harms and wrongs are incommensurable? Retributive justice holds that punishment should be proportional to moral desert. Those who choose to commit serious wrongs deserve serious punishment, regardless of whether punishment serves social purposes. This grounds punishment in backward-looking moral facts rather than forward-looking consequences. But measuring desert precisely proves impossible without interpersonal comparisons of moral badness. Is killing in jealous rage worse than killing for money? Is white-collar fraud worse than violent assault? Intuitions diverge sharply, and no metric exists to resolve disagreements objectively. Consequentialist approaches justify punishment by its effects on future behavior. Punishment deters potential offenders, incapacitates dangerous people, and rehabilitates those who can be reformed. This makes punishment instrumentally valuable rather than intrinsically deserved, but consequentialism permits punishing the innocent when this maximizes good outcomes. If executing a scapegoat would prevent riots that kill more people, consequentialism may endorse this injustice. Most people recoil from this conclusion, suggesting punishment requires desert-based constraints, even when this reduces overall welfare. Sentencing guidelines attempt to systematize proportionality through numerical calculations. Crimes receive base points modified by aggravating and mitigating factors to determine sentence ranges. This promotes consistency across cases and constrains arbitrary judicial discretion. Yet the numerical precision is false precision that obscures value judgments buried in the formulas. Should prior convictions increase punishment because they show bad character, or because repeat offenders pose greater future threat? The answer determines whether justice is backward-looking or forward-looking, but guidelines simply assign numbers without resolving underlying question. Racial disparities in criminal justice expose the gap between ideal and reality. Black defendants receive longer sentences than white defendants for similar crimes, even controlling for criminal history. Police concentrate enforcement in minority neighborhoods, detecting crimes that occur equally in white neighborhoods but escape detection. Jury composition affects conviction rates, with all white juries more likely to convict black defendants than racially mixed juries. These patterns cannot be fully explained by differential crime rates or objective risk factors. Implicit bias, stereotyping, and structural racism produce systematically unjust outcomes despite formally neutral procedures. Some argue that equal treatment under unjust laws cannot achieve justice. If drug laws are themselves unjust, applying them consistently does not make enforcement just. If poverty drives crime, while wealthy crimes go unprosecuted, punishing poor criminals merely reinforces structural inequality. Transformative justice requires changing underlying conditions rather than fairly distributing punishment within unjust system. But others respond that consistent rule of law is precondition for justice, even when specific laws are imperfect. Allowing official discretion to correct unjust laws invites even worse abuses than mechanical enforcement of bad rules. Economic justice confronts the problem of designing markets that distribute resources fairly while maintaining productivity. Pure laissez-faire capitalism generates enormous inequality and leaves basic needs unmet for millions. But heavy redistribution reduces incentives for productive work and investment. The optimal tax and transfer system must balance these competing considerations without definitive theoretical solution. Progressive income taxation represents compromise between equality and efficiency. Taking larger percentage from high earners' funds, services for low earners while maintaining incentives for productivity. But optimal tax rates remain hotly contested. Marginal rates above 70% existed in the United States during mid-20th century when economic growth was strong. This suggests high taxes need not destroy prosperity. But correlation does not prove causation, and many factors beyond tax rates affect growth. Empirical economics cannot definitively resolve normative questions about how much redistribution justice requires. Healthcare exemplifies distributive justice challenges with life and death stakes. Medical resources are finite, while needs are nearly unlimited given expensive life-extending treatments. Every healthcare system must ration somehow. The question is whether rationing occurs through prices, waiting lists, lotteries, or merit-based allocation. Each method embodies different conception of justice with different winners and losers. Market-based healthcare distributes medical care according to ability to pay. This rewards productivity and preserves choice, but leaves poor people with inadequate care. Single-payer systems guarantee universal coverage, but require rationing through waiting lists and restricted treatment options. Two-tier systems allow those who can afford it to purchase faster or better care while providing baseline for all. This permits inequality while ensuring minimum but may undermine political support for public system as wealthy exit. No system avoids trade-offs between access, quality, choice, and cost. Triage protocols must decide who receives scarce resources during emergencies. Utilitarian principles suggest treating those who benefit most, maximizing lives saved or years of life preserved. But this may sacrifice elderly or disabled people who benefit less from treatment per unit of resource expended. Equal access principles suggest lottery or first come, first served, regardless of expected benefit. But this wastes resources when treating person A saves 1 life, while treating person B could save 5 lives. Desert principles suggest prioritizing healthcare workers or others who provide essential services. Each principle captures something important. None fully satisfies when resources run out. Educational justice attempts to provide equal opportunity despite vast differences in family circumstances. Children of educated, wealthy parents enter school with enormous advantages in vocabulary, background knowledge, and academic skills. Equal per-pupil spending cannot overcome these advantages when disadvantaged children need far more resources to achieve comparable outcomes. But weighted funding that gives more to disadvantaged students faces political obstacles from advantaged families who perceive this as unfair. School funding through local property taxes reinforces residential segregation by income and race. Wealthy districts spend far more per student than poor districts even within same state. State equalization formulas attempt to reduce these gaps, but rarely achieve full equality. Attempts to integrate schools through busing generated intense political backlash and white flight to suburbs. Housing patterns, school boundaries, and funding mechanisms interact to perpetuate educational inequality across generations, despite formal equality of opportunity. Affirmative action represents controversial attempt to correct historical injustices and current disadvantages. Preferential admissions for underrepresented minorities aim to increase diversity and counteract discrimination's lingering effects. But race-conscious policies appear to violate principle that individuals should be judged without regard to race. They may harm Asian applicants who face higher admissions standards despite being racial minorities themselves. And they may stigmatize beneficiaries by suggesting they gained admission through preferences rather than merit. Colorblind policies avoid these problems, but perpetuate disparities by ignoring how current inequality reflects past injustice. Class-based affirmative action offers alternative that assists disadvantaged students without explicit racial classifications. Socioeconomic status predicts academic outcomes independently of race and avoids explicit racial distinctions. But class-based approaches help fewer Black and Hispanic students because many face disadvantages independent of poverty. Racial discrimination exists apart from economic disadvantage and requires race-conscious remedies to address fully. Every approach to educational justice involves trade-offs between competing principles and affected groups. International institutions demonstrate challenges of justice beyond the state. The United Nations gives equal vote to nations of vastly different population and power. This respects state sovereignty, but means citizens of small nations have proportionally more influence than citizens of large nations. Weighted voting by population would be more democratic, but threatens small nation sovereignty. Security Council veto power concentrates authority in 5 nations based on post-World War II power distributions. This creates effective governance by engaging major powers, but institutionalizes inequality among nations. International trade rules, negotiated through World Trade Organization, illustrate how procedural fairness can mask substantive inequality. Formally, all member nations negotiate as equals, with one nation, one vote on treaty amendments. But wealthy nations with sophisticated legal resources and market power effectively dictate terms to poor nations with weak bargaining positions. Free trade benefits efficient producers while devastating workers and industries in less developed countries. Procedurally legitimate agreements can embed unjust outcomes when background conditions are profoundly unequal. Climate change negotiations confront justice between current and future generations and between rich and poor nations. Wealthy countries industrialized first and produced most historical emissions that caused climate change. Poor countries want to develop using fossil fuels as rich countries did before adopting expensive clean energy. But if poor countries follow the same development path, catastrophic warming becomes unavoidable. Justice seems to require either that poor countries sacrifice development or that rich countries provide massive technology transfers and financial assistance. Neither is politically palatable to those who must bear the costs. Reparations for historical injustices like slavery and colonialism raise questions about justice across time. Current descendants of slaves and colonized peoples suffer lasting disadvantages from historical wrongs. But current members of former colonizing nations did not personally commit those wrongs. Should they bear costs of rectifying injustices their ancestors perpetrated? If not, how can historical wrongs ever be corrected when perpetrators and victims are all dead? If yes, this creates potentially unlimited liability extending arbitrarily far into past. Transitional justice confronts these problems when societies emerge from conflict or dictatorship. Truth and reconciliation processes document atrocities without necessarily punishing perpetrators. This serves goals of acknowledgement and social healing, but may fail to satisfy victims' demands for accountability. War crimes trials punish leaders but often ignore mass participation that enabled atrocities. Lustration policies ban former regime officials from government but may perpetuate divisions rather than enabling reconciliation. No approach fully satisfies competing demands for justice, peace, truth, and reconciliation. Restorative justice offers alternative to punitive approaches by focusing on repairing harm. Offenders meet victims to understand impact of their actions and develop plans to make amends. This centers victims' needs rather than abstract state interests in punishment. It may rehabilitate offenders more effectively than incarceration by building empathy and responsibility. But restorative justice works best for less serious crimes between parties with ongoing relationships. Applying it to murder or mass atrocity strains the model beyond viability. Cross-cultural variation in justice conceptions complicates universal theories. Western emphasis on individual rights conflicts with communitarian values prevalent in many non-Western societies. Honor-based justice systems prioritize family and community reputation over individual autonomy. Some cultures emphasize restoration over punishment, others emphasize collective responsibility over individual guilt. Universal human rights doctrine asserts that certain principles transcend cultural differences, but critics argue this imposes Western values while dismissing alternative conceptions as backward or unjust. Empirical research on justice judgments across societies reveals both universals and variation. All cultures punish free riding and reward cooperation, though the thresholds and mechanisms vary. Market-integrated societies show stronger preferences for equal divisions than isolated societies. Larger communities exhibit more costly punishment of unfairness toward third parties. This suggests justice intuitions develop partially through social learning within particular institutional contexts rather than being purely innate. Culture shapes how biological moral foundations manifest in specific norms and practices. The practical challenges of implementing justice reveal that institutions matter as much as principles. Correct theory of justice is insufficient if institutions lack capacity to gather information, resist corruption, and adapt to circumstances. Strong institutions can produce tolerably just outcomes even under imperfect theory. Weak institutions will produce unjust outcomes regardless of how philosophically sophisticated the underlying principles are. Justice requires not only abstract ideals, but also concrete mechanisms that function despite human limitations. Part 8. Critiques, Paradox and Limitations. Justice theories face objections so powerful that no existing framework fully withstands scrutiny. Each major approach contains internal tensions, counterintuitive implications, or question-begging assumptions that critics exploit relentlessly. Understanding these critiques is essential for intellectual honesty about what justice theories can and cannot deliver. Philosophy has not solved justice. It has clarified why justice is so difficult to solve. Utilitarianism's problems extend far beyond the objections previously mentioned. The theory cannot explain why we have special obligations to particular people, like family members or compatriots. From utility-maximizing perspective, strangers' welfare matters equally to your child's welfare when stakes are identical. But most people believe they have stronger duties to their own children than to strangers' children. Utilitarians can try to show that special relationships maximize utility instrumentally. But this makes love and loyalty merely useful rather than intrinsically valuable, distorting their moral significance. The separateness of persons objection cuts deeper. Utilitarianism aggregates utility across people as if society were a single entity experiencing total welfare. But there is no social entity. There are only individuals, each with their own distinct experiences. Benefits to person A do not compensate losses to person B because different people experience the benefits and losses. Justice must respect boundaries between persons rather than treating society as an organism whose parts can be sacrificed for overall health. This objection strikes at utilitarianism's foundational move of summing utilities across individuals. Adaptive preferences create additional problems. People adjust preferences to match available options, so those in terrible circumstances often report high satisfaction. Women in oppressive societies may say they prefer traditional roles because they adapted to lack alternatives. Maximizing actual preferences perpetuates injustice by treating adapted preferences as legitimate rather than distorted by unjust conditions. But overriding people's stated preferences based on what they should want seems paternalistic and disrespectful. Utilitarianism oscillates between respecting problematic actual preferences and imposing controversial ideal preferences. Contractarianism faces the obvious objection that no actual contract ever occurred. Hypothetical agreement cannot bind real people who never consented to anything. Rawls responds that original position represents our considered moral judgments about fairness rather than simulating actual choice. But then why frame the argument as contract at all? The contractual language is metaphor that obscures the real work being done by moral intuitions about equality and reciprocity. Dropping the contract metaphor might strengthen rather than weaken the theory. The publicity condition generates paradoxes for contractarian justice. Principles of justice must be publicly justifiable to all reasonable citizens. Gap. Ones. But some beneficial policies work only if people do not fully understand them. If everyone knows the rules are designed to manipulate their behavior, they may react in ways that undermine the policy's effectiveness. Should we choose less effective but more transparent policies over more effective but less transparent ones? Publicity requirements may sacrifice welfare to respect for persons as autonomous agents. Stability problems haunt contractarian theories. Principles that rational people would agree to behind veil of ignorance may not be stable once veil is lifted. Those who discover they are talented and well-positioned may reject egalitarian principles they chose from ignorance. Rawls argues that principles chosen fairly become part of people's identity and thus self-sustaining. But this assumes justice shapes preferences rather than being subject to them. The stability question may require thick theory of moral psychology that contractarian framework cannot supply. Egalitarianism faces the levelling down objection most forcefully. Strict equality requires reducing inequality even when this makes everyone, including the worst off, worse in absolute terms. If we can eliminate inequality only by destroying resources, equality demands destruction that benefits no one. This reveals that equality is not valuable in itself, but only instrumentally, or as constraint on acceptable inequality. But then egalitarianism is not fundamental principle. Something else, like sufficiency or priority, must ground our concern. Luck egalitarianism attempts to distinguish chosen from unchosen inequality. Justice requires correcting inequalities that result from bad brute luck, but permits inequalities from personal choices. If you become poor through bad gambles, you deserve your poverty because you chose the risk. But this seems harshly unsympathetic to those who make bad choices and implies they deserve no assistance. Moreover, distinguishing choice from luck proves impossible since circumstances shape what choices seem reasonable. The poor person who drops out of school faces different options than wealthy person who drops out. The metric problem remains unsolved across all distributive theories. What should we equalize? Welfare, resources, capabilities, opportunities, or something else? Each metric generates different policy prescriptions with no neutral way to choose between them. Welfare captures what ultimately matters but depends on problematic subjective states and expensive tastes. Resources seem objective, but their value depends entirely on what they enable people to do. Capabilities track functioning, but require specifying which capabilities matter and how to weight them. Opportunities seem fair, but starting positions remain unequal in ways that undermine genuine equality of opportunity. Every metric faces problems that motivate moving to alternative metric in endless cycle. Responsibility undermines all simple distributive principles. People make choices that affect their outcomes in ways that seem morally relevant. The worker who saves responsibly ends up wealthier than equally paid worker who spends recklessly. Redistributing to achieve equality seems unfair to those who sacrificed for future security. But holding people fully responsible for outcomes ignores how circumstances shape their capacity for responsible choice. The tension between equality and responsibility may be fundamental rather than resolvable through correct theory. All theories face the demandingness objection that justice requires too much. If justice demands eliminating poverty globally, affluent people must sacrifice most of their wealth to help distant strangers. If justice requires maximizing utility, we must constantly calculate expected consequences and optimize every action. These demands exceed what most people can psychologically sustain or morally consider required. But if justice permits us to prioritize ourselves and loved ones over strangers, this seems arbitrary from impartial perspective. We oscillate between theories too demanding to be psychologically realistic and theories too permissive to be morally adequate. Common sense, morality, and philosophical justice systematically conflict. People have strong intuitions that desert matters, loyalty is virtuous, and some actions are absolutely wrong. But philosophical theories often reject these intuitions as confused or parochial. Should theory override common sense? Or should persistent common sense intuitions constrain acceptable theories? Reflective equilibrium seeks balance between intuitions and principles by adjusting both until they cohere. But this method provides no guarantee of convergence, and different people reach different equilibria. The publicity of justice itself may be problematic. Constantly asking whether actions are just may undermine valuable attitudes like spontaneous generosity or love. The good parent does not calculate whether giving extra attention to needier child satisfies justice. They respond to need directly without mediation through abstract principles. If justice thinking corrupts valuable relationships by making them self-conscious and calculative, perhaps justice should govern institutions while leaving personal relations to other values. But drawing this boundary begs questions about which spheres are personal and which are political. Indeterminacy plagues justice at its foundations. Many cases present conflicting considerations with no principled way to weigh them against each other. Freedom conflicts with equality, utility conflicts with rights, desert conflicts with need. Theories that make one value absolute avoid trade-offs by denying that conflicts are genuine. But this seems dogmatic when faced with cases where both values clearly matter. Pluralist theories acknowledge irreducible values but provide no decision procedure for resolving conflicts between them. Justice may be essentially contested concept, admitting multiple reasonable specifications rather than unique correct theory. The fact-value gap remains unbridged despite centuries of philosophical effort. Descriptive facts about human nature, social institutions, or economic relationships do not entail normative conclusions about what justice requires. We cannot derive aught from is without smuggling in normative premises. But normative principles disconnected from facts become empty formalisms with no practical guidance. Justice theories must somehow connect facts and values while respecting their logical independence. No satisfactory account of this connection has achieved consensus. Relativism threatens to undermine justice's objectivity entirely. If different societies have genuinely different values, perhaps no universal principles of justice exist. What seems just in one culture may be unjust in another, with no neutral standpoint to adjudicate. But this makes justice arbitrary and permits atrocities if local culture endorses them. Universalism about justice seems necessary to condemn injustice wherever it occurs. Yet imposing universal principles on unwilling societies looks like cultural imperialism. The paradox of political legitimacy compounds these difficulties. Legitimate authority requires voluntary consent, but requiring unanimous consent makes governance impossible. Majority rule permits binding dissenters to decisions they reject as unjust. But if majority can override individual rights, what makes democracy different from tyranny of the majority? Constitutional constraints on majority rule seem necessary, but who determines what constraints are legitimate? Courts imposing constitutional limits override democratic decisions, creating counter-majoritarian difficulty. Every solution to legitimacy paradox generates new problems about who has authority to make authoritative decisions. Time further complicates justice in ways theories rarely address adequately. Should we judge actions by consequences known at the time or by actual outcomes discovered later? Policies that seem just given available information may prove disastrous when unforeseeable consequences materialize. But requiring foresight we cannot possess makes justice impossible to achieve. Similarly, should rectifying past injustice take priority over addressing current injustice or preventing future injustice? Limited resources cannot address all injustice simultaneously, forcing tragic choices between competing temporal claims. Uncertainty pervades justice deliberations at every level. We cannot know consequences of policies with precision, cannot measure subjective states reliably, and cannot predict how institutions will evolve. Yet justice theories typically assume complete information that decision-makers never possess. Theories that work under idealized conditions may fail catastrophically when applied under realistic epistemic constraints. Epistemic humility may be more important than theoretical sophistication for practically achieving tolerable justice. Common misconceptions about justice persist despite philosophical correction. Many believe justice requires treating everyone identically, ignoring relevant differences in circumstances and needs. Gap. 1. Many confuse justice with legality, assuming that whatever law permits must be just. Many think justice is purely procedural. ignoring substantive outcomes that procedures generate. Many believe justice demands strict equality, missing how some inequalities can benefit everyone, including the worst off. And many think justice is whatever feels fair intuitively, ignoring how intuitions reflect self-interest and cultural conditioning. Perhaps the deepest limitation is that justice is not the only value. Love, compassion, mercy and forgiveness sometimes require setting justice aside. The parent who forgives the child who wronged them acts well, even though justice would demand accountability. The society that offers amnesty to enable reconciliation may achieve peace that strict justice would prevent. Justice is necessary but insufficient for good society. It must be balanced against competing values that also matter morally. No theory specifies when justice should yield to other values and when it should remain paramount. The ultimate limitation is that perfect justice may be impossible for beings like us. We are partial to ourselves and loved ones, biased by self-interest and group loyalties, and limited in knowledge and foresight. The psychological machinery evolution, built for small-scale cooperation, may not scale to anonymous mass societies. Our moral intuitions conflict irresolubly because they reflect adaptations to different ancestral problems. Rather than discovering perfect justice theory, perhaps the task is managing inevitable injustices as well as imperfect creatures can. This does not mean abandoning the pursuit of justice. Even if perfect justice is impossible, more justice is better than less justice. Even if theories are imperfect, they clarify what we are pursuing and why current arrangements fall short. The value of justice philosophy lies not in providing final answers, but in sharpening questions and revealing assumptions. By understanding justice's complexity and limitations, we can build institutions that respect its demands while acknowledging human reality. This may be the most we can hope for, but it is not nothing. Justice remains humanity's most ambitious moral project. It demands that we organize society so every person receives what they deserve, are owed, or need. It requires balancing competing values that cannot all be maximized simultaneously. It asks us to transcend partiality and self-interest to adopt impartial perspective. These demands exceed human capacity in many contexts, yet the alternative to pursuing justice is accepting injustice as inevitable rather than regrettable. That alternative is intolerable for beings with moral consciousness. So we continue the project, knowing it will never be complete, because the pursuit itself expresses what is best in us.